Motivational speakers love to quote from it. Social activists draw inspiration from it. Poets and songwriters love to weave it into their work. Where did the Bible come from, and why is it still the world's most popular book? If you've ever made a serious study of history, you'll know that the Bible has had a profound effect on the languages and cultures of Western nations. In fact, its influence can be felt right around the world. Despite the fact that the Bible's oldest books are thousands of years old, it is still the world's best-selling volume, and it's most translated. Even if you don't claim to be a Bible reader, the chances are you've quoted from it often without even knowing it. If you've ever said you're a person after my own heart, or he went from strength to strength, or I got by the skin of my teeth, you've been quoting from the Bible. If you've ever said do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, love your enemies, or blessed are the peacemakers, you've been borrowing material straight from the pages of the Bible. The word Bible comes from the Greek biblia, which means the books. The Bible's really a whole library of books, 66 of them in all. They were written over a period of 1500 years, starting in the time of Moses around 1450 BC. They were written by philosophers and doctors, kings and princes, shepherds, farmers and fishermen. Despite the fact that the Bible was written over so many centuries, it is an amazingly consistent book. It tells just one great epic story. The Old Testament of the Bible is made up of the Hebrew Scriptures, and it was complete by about 400 BC. It starts off with God's creation of the world and the fall of humanity in the Garden of Eden. It traces the development of the Hebrew people, and more importantly, how God revealed himself to the world through them. And it finishes with a very important promise, that God will restore and redeem his people and pour out his Spirit of special favor on every nation on earth. The New Testament is uniquely Christian, but it grows out of the Old Testament. It tells the story of Jesus Christ and was written by his apostles, his first disciples, and by their close followers in the period between the resurrection and 100 AD. Hebrew prophecies had indicated that God would send a Messiah, an anointed one to save his people. For Christians, Jesus is the fulfillment of that prophecy. In fact, the word Christ is just the Greek term for Messiah. Jesus' life lined up with Hebrew prophecies in hundreds of details, both great and small, from the circumstances of his birth to key events of his life, and even to the agony of his death. Someone said the center of the Bible is not the middle page, it's Jesus Christ. The Old Testament looks forward to his coming. The New Testament records the event, and it shows how the power of Jesus' Spirit transformed often cowardly men into great apostles of faith, men who changed the world through their word and their example. A couple of centuries after Jesus' lifetime, there were quite a few books floating around that claimed to contain stories about him or the writings of his apostles. Gradually, the churches sorted out which books were genuine from those that were not. They placed the rejects alongside other books that Jewish scholars had already rejected from their scriptures. Collectively, these books became known as the Apocrypha, which means hidden from view. Apocryphal books are interesting from a cultural point of view, but they're not generally considered to be the inspired word of God. After the Emperor Constantine endorsed Christianity, the church began to become more and more hierarchical. In fact, in many ways, it resembled the old Roman Empire more than the new community Jesus had talked about. Educated priests started using Latin as their official religious language, for praying, for singing, and even for Bible reading. Now, the Bible had been written in Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, languages of the common people, but Latin was the language of the educated, It was largely incomprehensible to most believers, especially as the church moved further westward. So, for hearing from the Bible, the people had to rely on their priests, who basically stood between the people and the book. Linked to the problem of language was the issue of cost. Before the advent of the printing press, reproducing books like the Bible was an arduous, costly and time-consuming process. Scribes would spend many months on one manuscript, making sure they copied the scriptures without even the slightest error. So even if they could read Latin, which most could not, the common people could never afford the luxury of their very own Bible. In the 14th century, a new cultural movement sprang up in Italy and quickly made its way across Europe. It marked the end of medieval thinking. Through the Middle Ages, people had been content to see themselves as part of a community, the family, the village, the guild, and so on. But this new movement, this Renaissance, brought with it a new individualism and a thirst for personal development and for knowledge. People were looking for books they could actually own. They could study in private, books that were written in their own languages. People were especially hungry for the book that they respected most of all, the Bible. One of the first people to recognize the need was John Wycliffe. A 14th century preacher and academic, Wycliffe said that common people deserved a Bible they could actually read. So he and his followers set about producing one. He said that if people could actually read the Bible, they could hold church authorities accountable. They could check to see whether their leaders were living as Jesus had said they should. He also said that the Bible is the ultimate authority in human life and not the mandates of kings and popes. To the church authorities, Wycliffe was a dangerous revolutionary who had to be silenced. He was excommunicated from the church, and once he died, they burned his bones and threw them into a river. But you can't keep a good man or a good book down. Though there was no printing press to give Wycliffe mass production, his Bible did find its way into the hands of many people, and it helped to lay the foundation for a key event that took place 3 centuries later, an event called the Reformation. In 1515, the German monk Martin Luther had a profound insight that was destined to reshape the church across much of Europe. Reading the works of Paul, he found that people are not made right with God by their good works or their great intentions, or even by their obedience to the church. Paul said that salvation is not something that can be earned. We must receive it as a gift. We accept it by believing in Jesus Christ and what he did for us on the cross. At first, Luther's ideas attracted very little attention because only a few academics got to hear them. So Luther decided to take his ideas to the people in the German language rather than Latin. He also decided that his people needed a new translation of the Bible. So he set about translating the New Testament and then the entire Bible, a process that took him 10 long years to complete. Meanwhile, William Tyndale was setting out to produce a new English translation. Unlike Wycliffe, who worked from the Old Latin, Tyndale translated large sections of the Bible from their original languages. He was heavily persecuted and fled for his life to Germany. His New Testament was printed there and smuggled back into England. Eventually, the church authorities caught up with Tyndale in Belgium, and for his crime, giving the Bible to the people, he was strangled to death and his body was burned at the stake. The English language actually owes a great deal to Tyndale's Bible. Tyndale gave us many words and phrases that we still use today. Phrases like "my brother's keeper," "the powers that be," and "salt of the earth" are just a few of the many coined by Tyndale. When he couldn't find an English word to match something in the Hebrew or Greek, he simply created a new one. And so we have Jehovah for one of the Old Testament names for God, and Passover for the Hebrew feast. He also gave us words like scapegoat and atonement. Not long after his death, Tyndale's work provided the basis for the first full English Bible, the Coverdale Bible, released in 1535. But it was a French-born Swiss preacher who influenced and inspired one of the most effective of the early English Bibles. John Calvin preached in Geneva, where he was an important, though sometimes overbearing, leader of the Reformation. He recognized that if the ideas of this Reformation were to spread right across Europe, the new technology of printing would play an important role. Religious exiles were flocking to Geneva from all over Europe. Many came from Calvin's beloved France and from England. Neither of those nations had experienced the Reformation in any really powerful way. Calvin encouraged people to carry copies of his writings back to their homelands. Some English scholars were so inspired by Calvin's teachings that they produced the Geneva Bible in 1560. It contained many special notes to help people understand what they were reading, and it became very popular. Men like Wycliffe, Tyndale and the followers of Calvin produced some very important English Bibles, but it was another version that was destined to become the prince of them all. It was commissioned by King James I and released in 1611. It was called the Authorized Version, but most people today know it as the King James Bible. It was originally conceived to help stop political arguments as much as to bring religious understanding, but it's gone on to have a profound impact on the culture, the language and the spirituality of English-speaking nations across the world. The translators who worked for King James weren't trying to produce something aesthetically beautiful. Their major priority was to produce an accurate translation. Yet in the end, they left us with one of the most elegant, most magnificent pieces of literature in all of history. For generations, their Bible became part of the everyday lives of English-speaking people everywhere. This was the Bible that was carried by the Pilgrims to the New World. This was the Bible that was quoted by Abraham Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address. This was the Bible that inspired Handel's Messiah and hundreds of those highly emotive Negro spirituals. The Bible's had a profound effect on thought and culture right around the world. It's been recast into 2,000 languages. That's not including the countless partial translations and all the audio versions for non-written languages. It's an astonishing figure when you consider that the works of Shakespeare have been translated into just 50 languages. The Bible's a very old book, and yet it remains fresh in every culture and every generation. Today, the Bible is right at the top of the world's bestseller list, a position that's occupied for many generations. It's been celebrated in the works of great writers, sculptors, painters and composers. It's been featured in musicals, operas and dramas. And it's provided the storylines for epic movies like The Greatest Story Ever Told, The Ten Commandments, and of course, Jesus of Nazareth. Today, you can read the Bible online. You can download it to your PDA. You can even read it on your WAP phone. The Bible, it seems, just goes from strength to strength. The philosopher Voltaire once famously predicted that 100 years after his death, the Bible would be a thing of the past. In one of the great ironies of history, or is it God's sense of humor, the home of Voltaire was later the headquarters for a famous Bible printing organization. Long after the time of Voltaire, people still reach for the Bible in times of crisis and of need. Whatever their language, personal experience or culture, people are still drawn to the Bible and the wonderful story it sets out to tell. That human beings were made in God's noble image, that they fell from grace because of stubbornness and pride, that God loved them so much He sent His own Son to redeem them, and that through faith in Christ they can exchange their despair for living hope. In the words of the great book itself, we can each have beauty for ashes and the oil of great joy instead of sadness.